Welcome on back to History 1302. This is Professor Tatum with another lecture for you. Here we will be starting our first of two lectures on World War II. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the start of World War II and how the U.S. ended up getting involved. And then in the next lecture, we'll look a little bit more about the U.S.'s role in the war and how the war impacted the U.S. We'll start out with a bit of context. This will be a really quick overview of some things you've already looked at. Then we'll look at the rise of some new alliances and the start of World War II. And we'll look at how the U.S. tried to stay in a state of isolationism and neutrality as this war was waging, and also at what factors began encouraging the U.S. to perhaps drift away from that isolationism. And then we'll look at what happened on what President FDR referred to as a date which will live in infamy and see what ramifications that had. So we need to keep in mind there have been some things in the years leading up to World War II that were having all kinds of tremendous impacts on Europe, one being World War I. Remember that a lot of European nations had lost millions of lives, some lost nearly entire generations of young men. Also, countries like Germany were greatly weakened by the end of the war. Germany was seen as the aggressor of the war, and under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, they were forced to pay reparations to countries like Britain and France. They were also placed in a very weakened state, forced to kind of demilitarize, forced to adopt a new parliamentary system of government that was kind of a mess. So Germany was in a pretty weak state after World War I, and Europe overall was just feeling a lot of that kind of gloom, lost still in these decades following that war. All right, then there was the Great Depression impacting countries around the world as well. Remember, this was a global phenomenon. There was an unstable global economy, largely again as a result of World War I. Things like the Allies depending on Germany and other countries for reparation payments, the U.S. depending on them to pay back war loans that had been loaned during the war. And it just created this cycle of debt as the U.S. began funding these guys to fund these guys to fund the U.S. back, basically putting their own money back into their pockets. And that created a system where if any country had any issues along the way, there was going to be a lot of problems, as there did turn out to be throughout this Great Depression. Again, none of this should be new. This is just a quick recap of what we've already been over, right? And I think we can learn a key lesson from this very dark, depressing, desperate state following World War I and during these years of the Great Depression. And that's that desperate times can create desperate people, and desperate people are a lot more willing to cling to dangerous ideas and to follow questionable leaders who they might not otherwise. So when we're in our most desperate times, we need to be aware of this and be cautious of who's promising us what and what agendas they might have. Unfortunately, there were a lot of leaders around the world in this period who started coming to power during this period by promising people in different countries that they were going to help restore their countries and help provide them a sense of hope. I mean, people are a lot more willing to follow the leader, and the ants go marching one by one during these very desperate times. So let's take a look at a few examples of a few leaders who took advantage of the weakened state of various countries after World War I during the Great Depression. This should pretty much be a recap of some other things you've already seen, but it'll be a good refresher. All right, first up, hailing out of the island of Japan, Emperor Hirohito. Boo! This guy dominated nearly all aspects of Japanese life, blamed the Great Depression and its impacts in Japan on a lack of space and resources, used that as an excuse to go invade Manchuria and later mainland China, committing very brutal acts during that invasion, carrying out sexual assaults, the Japanese army having killing contests among civilians. Very, very brutal stuff going on here. This guy also, of course, consolidated control over his nation by purging political rivals, banning free press, and spreading propaganda. Not looking too good for the people of Japan. All right, now right out of the Italian peninsula, get your rotten tomatoes ready for the throwing at Benito Mussolini. Boo! This guy really put the word dick in dictator by making people refer to him as Il Duce, or the leader in Italian. He used his legitimate position as prime minister to self-appoint himself as a dictator and take total control of the Italian government. He promoted fascism in Italy, which is, of course, an extreme sense of nationalism, based around a single leader who sees himself as the epitome of what it means to be a member of that nation. So, El Duce here saw himself as the ideal epitome of what an Italian should be, and therefore thought that he was best suited to lead Italy to greatness. He pushed his fascism through all kinds of propaganda linked to Italy's past, using images of the Roman Empire to try to kind of build up this sense of hope of being a great nation once again. And like Hirohito, he advocated imperial expansion to help spread Italy's influence to other parts of the world. For example, he carried out a very brutal invasion against the nation of Ethiopia. Hailing out of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. Boo! This socialist dictator succeeded Vladimir Lenin and used mass purges and exiles of political rivals to solidify control over the Soviet Union. Again, doing things like banning free press, using extensive propaganda to gain support for himself, claiming that he was going to bring things like bread and freedom for the people of the Soviet Union. Well, actually, all he brought was purges, starvation, and mass executions. Political rivals and people suspected of not supporting Stalin and his ideas were frequently rounded up and thrown into the Soviet gulags. All right, who could forget that timeless a-hole hailing right out of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, the biggest boo of them all! Boo! Like Mussolini, this guy used his legitimate position in government to take advantage and come to power. This was, mind you, after already unsuccessfully carrying out a coup against the government in Germany. Once he did get into power, he took total control, taking similar actions as these other guys we looked at, denying free press, executing political rivals, and spreading mass propaganda. This guy, of course, is also responsible for carrying out a Holocaust to try to create a master race of Aryan people. He also, like these others, led very brutal imperial invasions. For example, by the time the World War II started, he had already very brutally and illegally invaded Austria and Czechoslovakia. More on that to come. All right, so by the start of World War II, obviously there's some things kicking up with these kinds of guys coming to power. There is a new kind of surge of imperialism taking off after World War One. These kinds of things really aren't supposed to be happening under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but here we are. And so several nations around the world once again began forming the same types of military alliances that they had in the years leading up to World War One. Okay, where people are saying we don't necessarily have to get along and agree on every little thing, but we can at least agree to come defend each other in times of war, right? If somebody declares war on you, I'll back you up. If somebody declares war on me, you can come back me up. And that'll kind of discourage people from stopping us each from doing what we're trying to do in our own parts of the world. One alliance we want to be familiar with that started in these years leading up to World War II was the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo Axis, also known simply as the Axis powers. This was made up of Italy under Mussolini, Germany under Adolf Hitler, and Japan under Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese military. But we need to understand what really started World War II. What really kicked it off was an invasion of Poland. So this invasion of Poland was made possible when Germany and the Soviet Union formed a non-aggression pact. Again, saying we really don't like each other. We're kind of polar opposites, but we can at least agree not to kill each other and to help each other in certain situations. And their first way to kind of demonstrate the authenticity of this non-aggression pact to each other was by helping each other out with an invasion of Poland. So Germany kind of masterminded this plan. They said, we will invade here from the west. You guys help us out by invading from the east. And when it's all said and done and Poland is conquered, we'll kind of split it down the middle. Y'all keep y'all's half, we'll keep our half. And the Soviet Union agreed, and they carried out this very brutal invasion. We got to keep in mind, though, as I suggested, by this point, Nazi Germany under Hitler had already carried out some invasions that it was not supposed to have carried out under the Treaty of Versailles. All right, they had already invaded Czechoslovakia and Austria. And when they had invaded Czechoslovakia and Austria, Britain and France, who had been the leaders of the Allied powers after World War One, kind of looked at Germany and they said, look, guys, we're going to respond with what we call a policy of appeasement. We're going to appease you because we don't want to start another big war. But you know what you did is wrong. You cannot be out just invading any country you want to. You need to abide by the rules of the Treaty of Versailles and not be out invading any countries. right? If you go invade another country for no reason without coming and talking with us first, there's going to be hell to pay. And now here Germany is once again going out invading another country. At this point, Britain and France kind of turn back to Germany. They say, look, guys, our hands are tied. We told you if you go invading another country, there's going to be hell to pay. So now you got to pay it. And so Britain and France responded here by declaring war on Germany. All right, once these two countries here, two big powers, declared war on Germany, that kind of pitted them against all of the Axis powers now. Remember, there's also Japan and Italy aligned with Germany here saying, we'll back you up if anyone declares war on you. So now all of those countries were at war with Britain and France. From there, we're going to see things get really messy, and a lot of countries start declaring war on each other. This is pretty historically significant because this led to the start of World War II. Germany carried out a series of devastating bombing campaigns referred to as blitzkriegs. That's just German for lightning warfare. They got that name because they would flash the sky up with the bombs that they were dropping so rapidly on these cities. And they'd come in and bomb everything to smithereens. And once the smoke cleared up a little bit, ground troops would come in as well and carry out an assault. By using these tactics, Germany was able to quickly occupy France. Britain, they did not occupy, but they severely devastated with a series of bombings known as the Blitz. Okay, we can see that this is a very devastating type of war. All right, it's no joke here. There's massive bombings already just to start this thing out after the people of Poland have already been slaughtered. All right, then a little later down the road, Hitler made one of the biggest mistakes in history. In the words of Tony Soprano, don't mess with the Russians, Janice. You do not mess with the Russians, if history has taught us anything. Yet, Hitler had a high opinion of himself. For various reasons, he decided to violate his non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and to invade the Soviet Union. Okay, so part of this was his ethnic and racial views of thinking that he was part of this master Aryan race that he was trying to expand throughout the world, and he saw the people of Russian descent as being a different type of white that was not quite as fit within the Aryan race, so they needed to be exterminated. This was also very just practical as well. We need to keep in mind that the Soviet Union is extensive, is very large, and has a whole lot of land. It has a whole lot of land. Okay, so that'd be very beneficial for Nazi Germany to have access to all that land and to bring it all under their domain. So put the date here, don't care that you know it, but June 1941, Hitler did violate his non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and had Nazi Germany invade the Soviet Union. Now we need to understand this is significant because this led to the USSR, which is the Soviet Union, joining forces with Britain, France, and China. All right. So Britain and France, of course, were enemies of Germany. China had been an enemy of Japan, who was an ally of Germany, right? And now the Soviet Union was basically switching sides and joining forces with all of them. So the Nazis really could have had this very large, powerful ally on their side, but by getting cocky and having their ethnic differences and deciding that they wanted all that access to all their territory, they kind of bit themselves in the ass. The Soviet Union jumped ship and joined with all of Nazi Germany's enemies, okay? So together, all of these powers, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, formed their own military alliance, referred to as the Allied Powers. This was somewhat an homage to and somewhat a continuation of the Allied powers that existed during World War I. So now we have these two alliances pitted off against each other, right? We have the Allied powers here, Britain, France, China, and now the Soviet Union, fighting against the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy. While I'm on this topic of the Soviet Union, I do think it's worth stopping for a minute to note a few things that frequently get missed in conversations about World War II. So we all know about the 6 million Jews and millions of others who were killed as part of the Holocaust carried out under Hitler and Nazi Germany. And that is extremely, extremely devastating and should not be undermined by any means. We do, on the other hand, need to understand that Joseph Stalin killed far more people than Hitler did during his time as dictator in the USSR. Some of those were the result of just mass famine, but the majority of those were intentional. Even some of those who died of famines, some of that does seem to have been intentional. Certain groups of people he kind of let starve to death. He was a very, very brutal guy, and I do not want to undermine that. We also need to understand that the Soviet Union had taken on the brunt of the fighting and faced the most casualties in terms of fighting Nazi Germany. Okay. So, really, by the time that the US joins the war, spoiler alert there, the US is going to join the war for anyone who didn't know that. By the time they joined, the Soviet Union had already done a great deal of damage to Nazi Germany, and they really don't get a lot of credit for that very frequently. So again, a lot of these get overlooked in conversations about U.S. history and World War II. Why? I don't know for sure. I mean, but there's a couple suggestions that I can make an educated assumption on in terms of not acknowledging that Stalin killed more people than Hitler. That sometimes gets brought up when people are criticizing communism and things like that, but not so much when we're talking about World War II, which is often considered to be the good war, because it really complicates things, considering the fact that the U.S. would eventually align with the Allied powers, who included this very, very brutal dictator here. Okay, and as we're going to see moving forward, that really complicates some of the causes that the U.S. claimed to be fighting for during World War II to be allied with this guy here, who's killing more people than Adolf Hitler. Also, as we're going to see after World War II, there's going to be extensive competition between the Soviet Union and the United States to dominate global politics, essentially, and global thought and global culture for that matter. That's referred to as a Cold War. And the legacies of the Cold War are still very much with us, even into the present day. And I would suggest that a lot of undermining the role that the Soviet Union played in World War II is a result of the Cold War, right? Trying to kind of undermine their role and say that the U.S. were the big heroes in the war, which I'm not arguing. The U.S. played a substantial role in the war, and we'll see how they brought it to an end very controversially. But that does not take away from the fact that the Soviet Union, despite being so brutal, took on the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany. Just a few things to point out there. Always like us to be thinking outside the box a little bit. So as this war began to wage, the U.S. Responded with isolationism and neutrality, saying we're going to stay out of this, largely because the U.S. was already occupied with trying to survive the Great Depression and implementing the New Deal. And they were not interested in going and getting involved in another global conflict that really didn't have a whole lot of interest to them. All right, they'd already done that once, and that fed a lot into the state they were suffering through now with the Great Depression. Not so interested in getting mixed up in that again. So the U.S. passed a series of acts known as the Neutrality Acts. They're as simple as they sound. This is simply the U.S. saying, we're not joining this war, and we're not in total support of either side. We may do some things that benefit either side, but we are not taking a side. Leave us alone. Right? The U.S. did receive a lot of criticism for this. As you can see here, this political cartoon is suggesting that Uncle Sam, representing the United States, just having a nice comfy sleep, while Europe over here is falling to. You got Hitler rising to power. You got the Blitz, which is that devastating bombing in Britain. You have Nazis doing all kinds of atrocious things, and Uncle Sam's just kind of ignoring it all. Right? President FDR, we need to understand, was not in favor of isolation and neutrality. All right, he wanted to support the Allied powers as much as possible. So he began to find ways to push the limits of neutrality as far as he could. And we're going to see there are several examples of the U.S. providing indirect support to the Allied powers long before they even joined the war. But first, I want to look at reasons that many Americans began drifting away from these ideas of isolationism. One reason was that there was growing resentment toward Nazi Germany. Now, again, to complicate kind of common historical narratives that get carried out in conversations, a lot of people like to think that the US and the Allied powers were blissfully unaware of what Hitler was up to in terms of the Holocaust. Otherwise, they would have cracked down on him a lot harder, a lot faster. But if we're being honest, that's just evidence does not show that, okay? Number one, really, unfortunately, what Hitler was doing was not any kind based on any kind of new ideas. It was based on ideas like eugenics that had been present even in the United States up to this point, and ideas of racial and ethnic superiority. Again, not uncommon in a lot of parts of the world by this point, including in the United States. And even the actions he was taking, which were extremely radical, he pretty much spelled out in this book here, Mein Kampf. We can consider this an autobiographical manifesto. Okay, so that's like a life story that also spells out his political vision. Mein Kampf, by the way, is German for my struggle. And in this book, he spelled out step by step what he thought should happen with Germany after World War One. He wrote this while he was in jail, by the way, after his failed uprising against the Weimar Republic, which was the government established in Germany after World War One. And he's writing in this book about how there should be a fascist state established in Germany and how there should be a Führer or leader of that state. And he kind of sees himself as a leader. And he starts talking also about how there can be this systemic elimination of people who don't fit within this master race of Aryan people. He spelled it all out here. And this book was no secret. This was widely publicized around Europe and definitely accessible as well in the United States. Okay. Um, and while some people very uncomfortably, that is to admit, supported these ideas spelled out in this book, there were a lot of people in the US and in other parts of the world, for that matter, who were very disturbed by what they read in this book, especially as they were watching some of it start to play out. And some people in the US were growing this opposition toward Germany as a result and saying, we need to go do something to stop this guy. Another clear example that demonstrates the fact that the Allied powers, including the US, were very well aware of what Hitler was up to before the US even entered the war, is the popularity of a film known as The Great Dictator. Right, this was a Charlie Chaplin film where he took advantage of having the same mustache as Hitler, played this great spoof on Hitler, where he mocked a lot of the things that were going on in Nazi Germany in terms of the Holocaust. Okay, and this film was widely popular in the U.S., so it's pretty clear that Americans kind of had an idea of what this guy was up to. It was no big secret, and as a result, you can imagine some people would have a lot of compassion for the victims of, say, for example, Nazi concentration camps, and they wanted to go get involved in stopping this guy. All right. Now, I will suggest the Allied powers, including the U.S., well, the U.S. isn't joining the Allies yet, I shouldn't say that. The U.S., as well as the Allied powers, did maybe underestimate the extent to which this was all going on. Okay, this was far bigger than anybody could realize. But the fact to sit there and say that, oh, everybody was blissfully unaware what Hitler was doing, that's just a load of malarkey. Another reason there was growing opposition toward Nazi Germany is Germany once again began using U-boats to sink ships heading to places like Britain and France. And there were some American ships sunk in the process. One particular was the SS Robin Moore. And people were pretty upset, once again, to be seeing these U.S. ships being sunk by the Germans. It started saying this here needs to be responded to with war. So, as this opposition was growing toward Nazi Germany among some Americans, others were beginning to resent the Japanese Empire, who again was aligned with Germany and Italy in the Axis powers. So, a lot of people in the US were disturbed, for example, by the very brutal invasions that Japan was carrying out against Manchuria, which was a Chinese territory, and China. As I suggested, there were things like mass rapes and killing contests of civilians, very brutal invasions. And as people were seeing this all play out, they thought maybe we should go and do something to try to stop this. Furthermore, there was also an incident in which some Japanese fighter pilots bombed a U.S. ship, the USS Panay, which was off the coast of China. Now, the Japanese government apologized for this. They claimed that the Japanese military was unaware that this was a U.S. ship or they would not have attacked it, but it was very clearly flying a U.S. flag, very clearly marked as a U.S. ship. So nobody really bought that. And a lot of people, understandably, were pretty upset that the Japanese military now had attacked a U.S. ship. And again, some people were saying, we can't just let this slide. We need to go to war over this. The U.S. in this instance did not retaliate, but there were severe tensions increasing against the Japanese empire now. One final issue that was growing a lot of resentment within a lot of Americans against the Japanese Empire was the end of what was known as the open door policy. This was a policy established in the late 19th century, so the Gilded Age, that it allowed open trade in China. Well, now that Japan had invaded China and they were at war with China, they kind of cut this policy off and made it more difficult for people to have trade relations in China. So that put a lot of economic pressure on the US and on a lot of other countries who they did business with. So we see a lot of resentment growing here now as well toward the Japanese Empire, in addition to their allies in Nazi Germany, right? These are all examples of things that are causing Americans to drift away from isolationism. That all sounds pretty historically significant. So, if I were writing about historical significance, say on an exam of something like the open door policy or Mein Kampf or the Great Dictator, I would know that those were examples of things that were pushing Americans away from isolationism. That's why they're historically significant. So, in response to this growing opposition toward the Japanese Empire, the US made a decision that would have all kinds of ramifications. They decided to place a boycott on Japan, and they cut Japan off from all kinds of very valuable goods, including metal, rubber, and most importantly, oil. All right. All of these things were vital not only for Japan to succeed economically, but also to wage war. Right. You're going to have tanks going around. You're going to need a lot of metal, a lot of rubber, and you're definitely going to need oil to fuel things like tanks, ships, etc. Okay. This was very devastating to Japan. And this kind of made some counter resentment, all right? Once the US declared this embargo against Japan, the Japanese government started getting really upset. And we'll see how that turns out for the US moving forward. Okay, so those were all examples, once again, of things that were pushing the US from isolationism. Now I want to look at examples of the US providing indirect support for the Allied powers before they even actually joined the war. One example we see in that regard is the cash and carry system. So, under cash and carry, the US would allow countries like Britain and France, okay, the Allied powers, to buy weapons from the US under a couple conditions. They had to agree to pay in cash. All right, so that meant that there'd be no long term agreements, no credit arrangements, anything like that. Just a simple buy it, be done with it. And they also had to cover transportation, right? So the goal here for the US was to kind of distance themselves from the responsibility of whatever these countries did with these weapons. They said, hey, all we did is sold some guns or some war materials. Whatever happens with them from here, we wash our hands off. We didn't take it there. They're not paying it off long term. They just made a simple, quick exchange. They gave us cash. We gave them weapons. That's that. What happens from here is not our fault. Think of this like this. If I know for a fact that one of your classmates has been going around poking people with a pin, and they tell me I am interested in poking these people with pins even more, and they come to me and they say, hey, I'd like to buy a pin. And I say, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll sell you a pin. I'll sell you lots of pins. But here's the deal. You got to pay me in cash. I'm not giving you any loans. We're not working on any long-term arrangements. It's got to be a quick, simple exchange. And you've got to take them wherever you're taking them. But whatever you do them with them at that point, it's not my problem. So I knowingly what they're going to do with it, sell them these pins. Next thing you know, you're getting poked with a pin. And you look at me and say, what the hell, Professor Tatum? Why did you sell them that pin to come poke me with? I say, hey, now, all I did is sell a pin. I didn't tell them what to do with it. I didn't transport it. I didn't give them a loan. Not my fault. You're still going to hold me somewhat responsible, aren't you? If I knew what they were going to do with it and I sold it to them? Yeah, that's kind of how cash and carry worked. But again, we can understand this is a clear example of the US providing indirect support for the Allied powers before joining World War II. Then later down the road, the US took this a step further with a system known as Lend-Lease. Here, the US was actually lending war materials to the Allied powers. All right, saying, in exchange for what we're giving you here, you can either give them back to us at the end of the war, or if they're not really in good condition, you can go ahead and just pay us for them later down the road. We'll work out a payment arrangement after the war. Well, this is definitely a step up from cash and carry, right? Now the U.S. is actually making loans here. They're making a long-term investment, and in many cases here, they're actually transporting these supplies and weapons to the Allied powers. Okay, so to help us make sense of this, I provided this GIF here from a James Bond movie. Anybody who's seen any James Bond movie, at least from Sean Connery up to Pierce Brosnan, I'm not so sure if the new ones have this, but there's always this scene here that get replays. It's kind of a running gag where Q, who's James Bond's handler in terms of gadgets and gizmos, will kind of walk him through everything he is providing him for this mission. He'll be like, "Here, you got this badass laser watch. You've got this car that can do all these cool things and has machine guns built in, and this and that." And after he kind of breaks everything down to him, he always says, "Do try and return some of this equipment in pristine order." And it's always the audience has a little chuckle because by the end of the movie that car is going to be blown up and that watch is going to be smashed to pieces, and Q's not getting any of that stuff back. All right, that's kind of what's happening here with Lend Lease. The U.S. is saying, "Do try to return some of this equipment in pristine order, and if you can't, just pay us back for it at the end of the war." Now, do you really think if you're giving people guns to go firing up and tanks to be using up during a war, that they're really going to be in good condition after they've been used? No, you're not going to want that back. So what they're doing here is they're basically saving face and kind of very indirectly, long-term loaning the Allies these war materials in exchange for a payment that they'll be receiving over a span of time. All right. Again, this is a very clear example of the U.S. providing indirect support for the Allies before they had even joined the war, right? While they're still claiming to be isolationist, neutral, etc. Right. Another example of the U.S. drifting away from isolationism, though, is with this idea of conscription, which is a military draft during peacetime. The U.S. was drafting young men from around the country, building up their military. Why would they be building up their military if they're in this very neutral state and they're remaining isolationists, staying out of global affairs? Well, very clearly, what they're doing there is they're building up their power to be ready for when they do join the war, right? This is clear evidence here that they were already contemplating eventually getting involved in this conflict, right? Clear example of the U.S. drifting away from isolationism there before they even joined the war. Last example I want to provide here of the U.S. providing indirect support here for the Allied powers. And I have a hard time even considering this one to be indirect. It's pretty straightforward. This comes in the form of what we call Eagle Squadron and Flying Tigers. These were two groups of U.S. pilots. Eagle Squadrons were fighter pilots, American fighter pilots, that is, who fought in World War II on behalf of Britain before the U.S. had joined the war. Flying Tigers were American volunteer fighter pilots. Okay, so they're volunteers, but still, they're American fighter pilots fighting on behalf of China before the U.S. officially joined the war. We have American soldiers here directly fighting on the side of the Allied powers before the U.S. is at war. This is beyond a clear example of the U.S. providing support for the Allied powers before joining the war. All right, so the U.S. can say all they want on one hand that they're isolationists, staying out of it, yet they're providing a lot of indirect support. And they can say that they're neutral, but they are very, very clearly choosing a side here. Okay, all these things we're seeing have been benefiting the Allied powers. All right. But what really got the U.S. to fully commit to this war was what happened at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the date of December 7th, 1941, which President FDR referred to as a date which will live in infamy. That date's just there for reference, though that is a good date to know. This is a very important moment in American history. And on this date, the Japanese Air Force bombed the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was docked at Pearl Harbor. This killed over 2,000 Americans, right? Somewhere around 2,400 Americans aboard that ship were killed. 6 ships were sunk and 188 aircraft destroyed. Again, I don't care you know those specific numbers, but just look at the devastation here. We're talking over 2,000 people killed, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, 6 ships destroyed. This was a devastating attack, all right? While this was going on, the Japanese were also carrying out an attack on the Philippines, which by this time we've already seen was a U.S. possession. This was very devastating for the U.S., and it really upset a lot of people across the country. Japan's motivations for this attack were in part linked to the U.S.'s support for China during the war. We saw a clear example of that with the American fighter pilots, um, the Flying Tigers who were fighting for the Chinese, right? But this was mainly a response to the U.S. embargo against Japan. Right? Remember, the U.S. had cut Japan off from very valuable resources, including oil, which has been devastating to Japan economically and made it more difficult for them to succeed in this war. So this was definitely a response to that embargo here. The very next day, President FDR urged Congress to declare war on Japan. Yes, there was a time when the president would actually ask Congress to declare war, not just say, "Hey guys, guess what? I went and bombed such and such country last night. Y'all better be ready to fight." But Congress gladly obliged. People were pretty shaken up by what had happened at Pearl Harbor, and the vast majority of the country was on board with joining this war. And so, as a result of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. officially entered World War II. Right? We can say that that led to the U.S. officially joining the war. Ah, shit! Here we go again. The U.S. was now involved in a second World War.